Good evening, everyone. I'm Leela Gandhi. I teach in English, and I am Associate Director along with Prigu of this center. And I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of this Center for Contemporary South Asia for Part 2 of the O.P. Jindal lectures for this semester. Our speaker, Nayanjot Lahiri, an eminent archaeologist and historian of ancient South Asia, is a distinguished professor at Delhi's Ashoka University. She previously served on the faculty of the Department of History at the University of Delhi, where she also received some of her training. Professor Lahiri's numerous publications in the general areas of ancient India, Indian archaeology, and heritage studies include the archaeology of Indian trade routes, finding forgotten cities, how the Indus Civilization was discovered, marshalling the past, ancient India and its modern histories, and Ashoka in ancient India. Her writings have appeared in various international peer-reviewed journals: Antiquity, Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, the Indian Economic and Social History Review, World Archaeology, and Economic and Political Weekly included. Now, many factors make Lahiri's academic work distinctive. She takes her place in a line of eminent modern historians of modern India who have defied both colonial and nationalistic revivalist appropriations of the Indian past, and who think of antiquity as a shared inheritance rather than a source of some lost former glory or of racial and religious purity. For such efforts, Lahiri was awarded the prestigious Infosys Prize in Humanities in 2013. Another honor followed in 2016, when she received the John F. Richards Prize from the American Historical Association for her most recent book, Ashoka in Ancient India. In their citation, the prize committee richly commended Lahiri for her accent on the story of a sovereign who reverses all conventions of kingship and proclaims his most successful war to be his greatest defeat. Lahiri has also been praised for a unique style that combines archaeological records, textual records, narrative attention to local history, and biography, in a commitment to make the past accessible and engaging for experts and non-experts alike. In a rave review of Lahiri's Ashoka book, the eminent Indologist Thomas Troutman makes the point well. He writes, "There is no," and I quote, "there is no academic throat-clearing and portentous speech meant to signal the writer's authority. Yet it is a breath of fresh air, a new way of looking at an irresistible figure of history." In addition to her immense scholarly output, Nayanjot Lahiri has made significant contributions to higher education and cultural policy. At Delhi University, she served as Dean of Colleges and as Dean of International Relations. She has been a member of Delhi Urban Art Commission and of a government committee to analyze the impact of the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Ordinance and to draft an alternate bill for Parliament. The bill became law in March 2010. Nayanjot Lahiri currently serves on the Indian Council of Social Science Research and on the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library Society. Her talk today, At the Crossroads of Politics and Progress, India's Archaeological Heritage Since Independence, will be followed by comments from two distinguished respondents whom I will introduce after the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lahiri.
Thank you, Leela, for that wonderful introduction. I can't tell you what it means for me because I have seen Leela Gandhi as an undergraduate student, and for this occasion to see her doing the honors, really, I can't tell you what a big honor it is for me. So, having made my career around the material relics of the Indian past, I also want to say that it's a great honor to be speaking about that heritage in a heritage institution like Brown University. Brown was founded in 1764, and I've been going around looking at the buildings, including this morning the Joukowsky Institute, which is in one of the oldest buildings here. And I'm saying this because I now teach at Ashoka University, where the students who will graduate this month constitute the university's first batch of undergraduate students. Now, as for the subject of my lecture, this is based on a book which will appear later this year called Monuments Matter, India's Archaeological Heritage Since Independence. And in that book, I actually do a kind of 360-degree overview, both of research on India's archaeological heritage in academia and in government departments of archaeology. But today, however, I'm only going to focus on what has survived of this heritage, how it has survived, and what are the pressures on India's heritage. Much of what I speak about concerns those parts of India's heritage whose institutional guardians are state actors. But as this sculpted stone would underline, people often treat the past as an element of their living present, offering worship and devotion to antiquities and artifacts in practically all parts of India. My lecture will set out the state, as it were, of India's heritage at the intersection of politics and progress from the point in time when India won independence from British rule on 15th August 1947 till the present. 1947 as a political watershed was central to the partitioning of India's past. This requires emphasis because while a great deal has been written about the horrific bloodbath that accompanied partition, about refugee rehabilitation, and many related issues, I think what has not been considered in quite the same way are the sorts of pressures and problems that the subcontinent's past had to then face. I will also look at the more recent decades in order to underline, while there is much that can be said and showcased around India's historic past. And also there are many more actors and agencies concerned with its preservation in relation to 1947. Actually, its heritage remains very vulnerable and compromised. In fact, it is far too fragile to be left to pious posturing about its beauty and greatness. So looking forward, I try to address the question, what can be done to make the archaeological past appear less fragile than it is today? But first, to go back to 1947. There are many different ways in which independence and partition impacted on the character of monuments. To begin with, there were attacks on monuments, which was seen as embodying the brutal character of British rule. An example of this is Bengal's Battle of Plassey site. The actual battle in 1757 was a somewhat minor military campaign, but it was memorialized by the British as a major military victory. Indians, though, viewed Plassey as a battle that the British had won through treachery and deceit rather than military prowess. So a campaign of protest against this monument began on 15th August itself, when demonstrators, describing the Plassey Memorial as a national disgrace, inflicted minor damage on it and demanded that it be entirely removed. So how did the government deal with such attacks? At Plassey, on the advice of the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, which is the largest institutional actor looking after archaeology in India, the ASI as we call it, the plaques, with the exception of this one giving the date of the battle, were removed from the monument. Second, there were changes in monuments because of policy decisions in England. Take the case of graves and tombstones. Actually, in March 1949, the British government stated that it was financially impossible to undertake a full-scale maintenance of all cemeteries in India and Pakistan, and that while London would try to maintain the most important of them, where these could not be maintained, the announcement said, I quote, they should revert to nature in a dignified and decent manner. So evidently, fiscal logic was the primary cause for the abandonment of several minor British graves and monuments in India. The British graves that have disappeared from the Rajpura Cemetery, which was located in the University of Delhi campus, I think must be a consequence of this decision. None of the pre-1971 graves have survived, and all that you have are a couple of entrance gates, like this one, with a very badly spat upon memorial stone. And behind it, as you can see, an illegal colony has come up, which incidentally is called Christian colony. At a third level, in the 1960s, the Indian government took the initiative to remove a large number of statues from prominent public places across India. The idea was that since these were colonial symbols, they ought to be removed from public sight. So in Delhi, for example, apart from the statues of British viceroys, that of King George V was removed. The king's statue used to stand under this canopy opposite India Gate in New Delhi, and it was relocated to the Coronation Park, where several other statues that were removed were also placed. This happened in many other places, including Kolkata and Mumbai. I may, of course, add that while other kinds of modifications may well continue to be introduced, the perspective of the federal government in relation to British monuments has changed over time. This is evident from the fact that in 1972, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, specifically ensured that the monument that was put up to commemorate the capture of Delhi by the British following the 1857 rebellion, and it was a very bloody recapturing, was not changed. This is the Mutiny Memorial, which is prolifically inscribed with details of how Delhi was recaptured. And in all these inscriptions, Indians who resisted the British are consistently designated as the enemy. Some 25 years after independence, there was a proposal by the Delhi Metropolitan Council to change the memorial. This proposal found its way to the desk of the Prime Minister, and in response to the proposal, she wrote to the Metropolitan Council. She said, I quote, I have seen pictures of the monument as well as the text of the inscriptions. I feel both should be left as they are for the historical interest. Although the tower symbolizes a dark period of our history, it will perhaps prevent future generations from forgetting how long and hard was the battle for freedom. All we need to do is to put up another inscription giving the Indian view of 1857. So this is what was put up. The Indian inscription merely says that the enemy of the inscriptions on this monument were those who rose against colonial rule and fought bravely for national liberation in 1857. So there are two different narratives on the same monument, and I think this is a much more thought out way of dealing with colonial messaging. But going back to the time of independence and partition, their impact on historic landscapes is another aspect that I want to mention. Religious monuments in several parts of India and Pakistan were under siege. In North India, there were attacks on shrines and on mosques, and the scale of damage is actually vividly documented in the ASI files. The manner in which Mehroli's Moti Masjid, which had marble minarets, were torn off. The minarets that you see here are actually completely contemporary reconstructions. The destruction of the grave of Shah Alam at Wazirabad. The grave was under this domed structure in the foreground, and this is a pre-partition photograph. The grave was surrounded by red sandstone screens, and this is what it looks like today. The grave has disappeared, and of course the sandstone screens were also completely broken in 1947. And of course, there are many other examples of this. But perhaps the play of politics in the partitioning of India's heritage was most dramatic in the partitioning of museum collections. So if we were to look at just the Indus Civilization collection, there were actually very prolonged negotiations, but thanks to some amount of goodwill and compromise, there was a division down the middle. That is why the National Museum in New Delhi displays such a splendid collection from both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Of course, in searching for a solution that was equitable to both nations, what was sacrificed was the integrity of some of the objects themselves. On the suggestion of the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, who by then was the advisor to the government of Pakistan, some unique articles were also divided down the middle. So this included a magnificent Mohenjo-daro necklace made of jade beads, gold discs, and semi-precious stones. This is the original, as it appears in John Marshall's report. This is the part which is with Pakistan, and this is the Indian segment of the same necklace. And as you can see, the one in the National Museum has 4 pendants, while this has only 3 pendants. And, you know, just to give you an insight on how this was decided, when you had an odd number, there was a throw of dice. And clearly, in this case, India made the right call, so it got 4 pendants. This carnelian and copper girdle, this too was divided down the middle. Oddly enough, nowhere in the correspondence relating to this is there a sense that the character of these objects was being permanently destroyed. Instead, you only have an overriding anxiety about carefully adhering to the arithmetic of division. Maybe 70 years after partition, it's time to think how one can, redress what is clearly a scandalous situation. Post-independence, political calls also had to be taken at the highest levels of government in relation to heritage conservation. So take the idea of a protective zone around monuments, that is the 100-meter zone and then a 200-meter regulated area. This was actually the idea of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, that there should be a security net around heritage buildings. So he ensured that the government created rules that within a certain area, no building could be put up without permission. But what of situations where protecting sites and monuments conflicted with economic development? This question became a key one in the 1950s when plans for building a massive irrigation project across the Krishna River were drawn up. The problem with the plan was that much of ancient Nagarjunkonda, and this is only a view of one set of monuments, would be permanently drowned in river waters. Nehru's confidential note on the subject emphasized this dilemma, and this is what the note said. He is writing to Maulana Azad about the situation, and he says the idea that this place where so much of our ancient history and culture lie hidden under the earth should be lost forever under the new lake has distressed me greatly. Yet the choice has to be made for the sake of the needs of today and tomorrow. So in order to save as much as possible, the ASI was tasked with a massive field research program and also a program for transplanting and rebuilding structures on the nearby Nagarjunkonda hill. So, this is a view of one of those structures. It's evident that in the early years of independence, in the face-off between development and conserving heritage, India's commitment to development overrode the need to protect the integrity of monuments. And this is a path from which she has not moved away. This brings up the whole question of pressures on monuments in more recent decades. The ASI protects some 3,650 monuments on the federal list. These are monuments of national importance. Then there are some 10,000 or so monuments that are protected by the different states and union territories. There are also religious endowments in whose custody there are about 12,000 structures. But actually, if you look at the monuments that dot the Indian countryside, they go into lakhs. And the National Mission on Monuments and Antiquities noted some 5 lakh unprotected monuments. Now, of the protected monuments, there are, of course, iconic ones like the Taj Mahal in Agra. But equally, a lot of mounds are also designated as monuments in India. These include those relating to the Harappan city of Dhulavira in Kutch, to what has emerged about the first city of Varanasi on the banks of the Ganga near Rajghat. The remains of broken down temples like the Devrani Jethani temples in Chhattisgarh, which are actually known for very unique sculpture, including this one of its type, Mahabhuta. This too is a protected monument. And in addition to this, there are elements which are very important for different tribal communities that are given the status of protected monuments, including this memorial wooden pillar of the 18th century, a type which the Mariagons treat as a signifier of prosperity. Even this inscription immortalizing a very lovely, loverly tale about the fact that a Devdasi called Shutanuka, Devdasi is a temple woman, was loved by a sculptor from Banaras called Devadina, and this is a 3rd century BC inscription This too is nationally protected. Having said that, though, I think it's necessary to remember that the mere fact that a monument has been declared as protected, or because antiquities are kept in different museums, does not ensure that they will be properly conserved. So this is the Gaya Museum in Bihar, which is used at least once a year to house security forces. This is when the annual Pitru Paksh celebrations at the Vishnupad temple take place. And as you can see, a precious pala sculpture is used as a clothes horse. Actually, such a state of affairs was constantly highlighted by Indira Gandhi during her tours of India as Prime Minister. So, for instance, after her visit to Elephanta in 1974, she wrote to the Chief Minister of Maharashtra about the scholar that she saw there. She says, "The trip to Elephanta was very pleasant, but I was shocked to see how dirty the surroundings are. Empty coconut shells, paper, tins, and all kinds of things were strewn around. The toilets were also very dirty with broken seats and the flush not working." When I spoke about this to the person who was with us, he thought he should have cleaned up for my visit. It is not at all important how things look when I go. What is important is the impression our visitors take with them. I'm strongly of the view that if it is not possible to keep such places clean, it is better to close them down to tourist traffic. So usually monuments are spruced up when there are visiting dignitaries, but in this instance, this eagle-eyed Prime Minister cared to look beyond the caves and picked out all the dirt, even in the public toilets. Only a woman can do something like that. In many instances, the squalor at protected sites is because of something as elementary as the absence of watch and ward staff. This has been the situation for decades. So in 1987, in reply to a parliament question, the government of the day accepted that 1/3 of the protected monuments were without monument attendance. Since then, the situation has only worsened. So in the committee that I sat on in 2010, the ASI stated that its staff strength did not permit deployment of even a single person on a full-time basis for more than 2,500 of its monuments. This means that more than 2/3 of India's federally protected monuments are actually practically unguarded. This is also true for state-protected monuments. My experience in Gujarat exemplifies this. So during fieldwork in the Junagadh district in 2011, I was very impressed with this list of monuments that the State Department of Archaeology handed to me. But when I went around, I realized that there wasn't a single staff to man any of those monuments. So beautiful monuments like the Pancheshwar caves, as a consequence, have been turned into rubbish dumps. You can just see all the garbage at the bottom. Beyond institutional neglect, a major problem with regard to several protected sites is that of encroachment. This is sometimes part of systematic land grab, and in some instances, politicians support the interests of encroachers. Now, India's top leadership, from Nehru to Dr. Manmohan Singh, have generally been very sensitive to the question of preserving the past. This, however, cannot be said for all rungs of political leadership. And in fact, there are instances where state leadership has attempted to push the federal government to allow for the destruction of protected sites. But before this, of course, I do want to add that there have been state chief ministers who have also been instrumental in protecting several monuments. To just give you one example of this, the Hari Parvat fort in Kashmir, came under the protection of the ASI because of one such chief minister. Now, this hill has multiple associations. The fort goes back to Mughal times. There are later additions. There is a Hindu temple there dedicated to the goddess Sharika. And there is also a Muslim shrine there, the shrine of Hazrat Maktoum Sahib. Inside the fort, there's a two-room structure on the left side of the main gate, which apparently was the prison cell of the Kashmir leader Sheikh Abdullah during the Quit Kashmir campaign in 1946. Whether it was his personal association or the state of the fort, or both, in 1977, Sheikh Abdullah, as chief minister, successfully got central protection for the Hari Parbat fort. But of course, for every such instance, you will find many others where state chief ministers have actually put pressure on the federal government to remove protected sites from the federal list. A particularly glaring instance of this is the appeal that was made by the Chief Minister of Haryana some years ago with regard to Khokra Court, where he sought the intervention of the Union Minister of Culture to get it denotified. Although the the mound was centrally protected, as a matter of fact, over the years, thousands of illegal buildings had come up. The immediate context for asking for a denotification was because the High Court, based in Chandigarh, had actually issued demolition notices to all the residents occupying these illegal buildings. And these were within the prohibited area of the monument. So the Chief Minister was actually now intervening on behalf of these residents, and he argued that actually nothing of national importance remained at the site because it had been excavated and everything had been picked up and taken by the professionals. So a team of the ASI was sent to the site in July 2009. Their report highlighted that Khokra Court actually had an antiquity that went back to the time of the Indus Civilization, and that it continued to be very important well till medieval times. This was sent to the Chief Minister of Haryana by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who at that point in time happened to hold the charge of the Ministry of Culture. And if you read Dr. Singh's note, he says that the Chief Minister would appreciate that it would not be proper to denotify this site, which finds mention even in the Mahabharata, that the Prime Minister of India, who was an economist by training, had to quote the Mahabharata to the Chief Minister of, his own party. I mean, this Chief Minister was from the Congress party, is something that I actually found very, very amusing. Actually, there are pressures not just on lesser-known mounds like this, but they extend even to the most charismatic of monuments, the Taj Mahal, which eventually saw the intervention of the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court of India. The litigation, which began in 1984, concerned atmospheric pollution and the harm that was being done to the Taj Mahal. However, it has a long history to it. It goes back to a decision to set up a refinery at Mathura. It was sometime in 1968 or 69 that the government decided that there should be a refinery in the northwest where the demand for petroleum products was growing very rapidly. After looking at a number of locations, Mathura was finalized without, I might add, giving any thought to the fact that the Taj Mahal was just 40 kilometers away, and the Bharatpur Bird Sanctuary was some 60 kilometers south of Mathura. The ASI was concerned about the pollution impact of the Mathura refinery as early as July 1973. This is what the internal notes reveal, and this is because press reports had been regularly appearing. It's difficult to believe that even if the ASI had not alerted the Prime Minister herself would not have read these press reports. But she allowed her cabinet to approve the Mathura refinery, and she gave it her own stamp of approval by laying its foundation stone in October 1973. Pollution concerns did not subside after the foundation stone was laid. There were now reports, even in the international media. Mrs. Gandhi was always actually very sensitive when there were international reports relating to environmental issues. She was conscious of the fact that after the first United Nations conference on global environment in Stockholm in 1972, she had actually acquired this reputation of being mindful of the pollution impact of industrialization. So in 1974, she got a committee set up to take all steps necessary to ensure that the Mathura refinery would not affect the monuments. Having committed a mistake, she was going to spare no effort to ensure that the mistake would not have an adverse fallout. The committee report, when it appeared, highlighted substantial pollution in that region caused by sulfur dioxide and particulate matter. It identified the pollutants ranging from power plants to some 250 foundries, but nothing came out of it. The refinery was commissioned, and consequently, in 1984, a petition was filed in the Supreme Court of India, where the judgment was eventually rendered in 1996. As it turned out, in the years to come, the railway shunting yard in Agra was closed, and so were many of the industrial units that were adding to the pollution load of the city. This happened because of this most celebrated case in environmental jurisprudence, which aimed to minimize the threat to the Taj Mahal. This would not have arisen had the refinery not been located at Mathura in the first place. In retrospect, Indira Gandhi's inability to act in this matter sits very uneasily with her interest in monuments. Excuse me. This, in any case, was no ordinary monument. And surely, as an environmentally sensitive person, she was aware of the impact that a refinery would have on the larger surroundings. So one can only assume that in this tussle between heritage and development, in this instance, she turned her face away from the Taj. So what emerges? I haven't been able to discuss, a whole lot of other issues which generate pressures on monuments, including the illegal antiquities trade. But even so, I think I've said enough to try and now explore the larger question of what one can do to improve matters. Now, what seems to me to be crystal clear is that an overwhelmingly top-down approach in India has failed. Even during the time of India's most proactive Prime Minister, standards of conservation did not improve. And ironically, it was because of her that there was an acceleration of degradation around the Taj Mahal. So clearly, the state, realistically speaking, will continue to be an important actor. But a wholesale reliance on administrative machinery which doesn't act and laws which are either unimplemented or are broken, looking back is not the best way forward. In India, there have been reports on the state of affairs, reports that have emanated from Parliament, from the committees that Parliament has set up, and also from the reports of the, CAG, the, Auditor General of India. So if you look at the Parliament reports, they are full of critical observations, exhortations, and recommendations. but there has been a lack of political will in implementing many of the recommendations. The Comptroller and Auditor General's reports are even more comprehensive and damning. In fact, this 2013 report is a must-read for anyone interested in the state of India's heritage. But even before this, the CAG in 2011 reported on a number of institutions, especially in Bengal. The Hazardwari Palace Museum, the National Library, the Indian Museum, the Asiatic Society, and so on. Now, before I read this report, I wasn't aware that the restoration of a batch of oil paintings in the Asiatic Society had remained incomplete even after a lapse of some 18 years. Or the fact that even till 2004, less than 50% of the collection of the Asiatic Society of Bengal was still not accessioned. The state of the Indian Museum was far worse. While the art and anthropology sections had some 88 and 84% of the objects respectively which were not accessioned, in the archaeology section, the number of accessioned objects was more than the number of objects possessed by the museum. The point, however, is that such reports are largely unread. This is because heritage and the state of India's heritage forms part of what I consider to be the excluded past in India, excluded from curricula. How much more all this would matter if it was out in the public domain, an integral part of what was taught and learnt about the heritage and its endangered state. I also think it's high time that professionals and experts outside government regularly prepare a State of India's Archaeological Heritage report. Such assessments are regularly made. The Center for Science and Environment puts together a State of India's Environment report. There are reports on health, on education, on the Indian economy. But I think it is ironical, even if unsurprising, that none of the major policy research centers have actually thought of the archaeological heritage as a priority area worthy of intervention and of the urgency of putting pressure through public interventions. So, as far as I'm concerned, the way forward depends upon our ability to create public pressure on the ground. On the question of building public pressure, I think there's a great deal that can be learnt from movements and interventions around the natural heritage. India's natural heritage and the built heritage have a lot in common. Both are very endangered. There is, of course, one big difference, and that is that if you compare public concerns around the environment and those relating to India's built heritage, in the case of the environment, there's actually a groundswell of popular movements. There is also an NGO culture where, people shout and scream when things go wrong. It's still a losing battle, but at least things are not uncontested and invisibilized. Also keep in mind that environmental studies forms part of what is mandated by the University Grants Commission to be compulsorily taught in schools and universities. This is what the Supreme Court 1991 judgment mandated at a time when there were huge environmental concerns being articulated by the judiciary. The court said many wise things in its judgment, but the most important for me was what it underlined, that it was necessary to adequately educate every component so that students were aware of the problems facing the environment. Now, this has not happened with relation to the archaeological heritage. I suppose in the case of the environment, there are livelihood issues involved. So, that propels action. In India, there hasn't been any social movement around the archaeological heritage because of that reason. So if that is not going to happen, one has to think of other ways of doing this. So maybe it's time to institutionally integrate municipalities, village panchayats in heritage conservation. Village and district level repositories should be created because, after all, it is villagers who have frequently ensured the survival of antiquities found in the vicinity of their settlements. To just give you two examples of this, this is from a village called Mavai, where in the shrine dedicated to the goddess of smallpox, you have a large number of sculptures that have been kept and they are worshipped as a manifestation of the goddess. This is from Mangashpur village, which is in Delhi. The iconic form of a village deity known as Dada Sangla is an old architectural sandstone fragment. So surely 70 years after independence, state policy should not be informed by the same logic that was deployed by the British against India, that India's heritage needs to be saved from its own people. A system in which community groups work in partnership with the state is likely to produce, I think, more positive results because these are the people who actually live in the vicinity of these landscapes, and they have already played a role in ensuring that such sculpture and artifacts have survived. Heritage laws also need to be re-examined. Indian laws are silent on historic landscapes. So in many regions of the world, historic landscapes are treated on par with monuments and structural ruins. But this is not so in India. So if you look at these images and sculpture near Tekalakota in Karnataka, it is actually the backdrop of the rocks which makes for a wonderful ambience. And it reveals how important it is to have structural elements in their original surroundings, surroundings which are untouched by development. But there are no provisions for protecting these surroundings. So that is why in an area like Mehrauli in Delhi, while you have numerous protected structures, the Aravalli landscape where these structures are is completely endangered. In fact, across the Aravallis, there are numerous scatters of the first inhabitants of Delhi, which is the Stone Age humans, but there's nothing in the current legal framework to provide effective protection for those sites, and that's why most of them have been destroyed. So basically what I'm trying to argue is one should try to generate local pressure for protecting monuments and landscapes. And let me add that where there is local pressure, things do change. I'll end with two examples. This is Yeasin Pathan. He was a clerk in a local school in Patra in the Paschim Mednipur district of Bengal. And thanks to his efforts, and he was very, very dogged, as many as 35 terracotta temples in his village were eventually given a few lakh of rupees for conservation by the ASI. The other example is from Maharashtra. A movement for the protection of built heritage began in Mumbai in the 1970s when a Save Bombay committee was created because a large number of colonial structures were being pulled down. Eventually, this led to the creation of the Bombay Environmental Action Group, and thanks to this group's efforts, the heritage regulations for Greater Bombay were passed in 1996. Now, what the heritage movement in Maharashtra has shown is that what works most successfully is when a non-governmental organization and a government department come together with a common purpose. The protection of the forts on the islands of Underi and Khanderi is an instance of this. Apparently, in 1978, there was a plan by a public sector undertaking, the Rashtriya Chemicals and Fertilizers Company, to construct a jetty which would have reached the forts and then gone beyond into the sea. This would have endangered these two forts. It was because of the Bombay Environmental Action Group, because of the pressure they generated, that A.P. Jamkhedkar, who was then the director of Maharashtra's government department, declared these two forts as protected monuments. Now, once they were declared as protected monuments, it was impossible to actually build the jetty. So things do change because of pressures from below. So in conclusion, I would say the more pressure that is generated, the more likely it is that the institutional guardians of India's archaeological heritage would cease living in denial. India's heritage deserves better than what has fallen to its lot. Its ownership across all sections of society is urgent and necessary if it has to survive in a better form than what we see around us. It's time that as a people, our pride in our heritage should not be surplus in relation to caring for that heritage, which continues, despite all the pious pronouncements, to suffer a huge deficit. Thank you. So I'm just going to switch this off.
Many thanks to Professor Lahiri for that wonderful and urgent talk. I'm delighted to introduce, in order of appearance, the respondents to this lecture. Peter van Dommelen is Joukowsky Family Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Anthropology at Brown, where he also serves as the director of the Joukowsky Institute. Professor van Dommelen's work is marked by the combination of theoretical orientation and practical fieldwork. His primary research is defined by the archaeology and anthropology of the rural Mediterranean and the Phoenician Punic world of the Western Mediterranean. To this field and to the question of anthropological perspectives in archaeology, he brings a particular focus on issues of colonialism and connectivity inflected by approaches from post-colonial theory. Professor van Dommelen read archaeology and classics at the University of Leiden. He also studied anthropology and material culture at UCL. Before coming to Brown, he taught Mediterranean archaeology at the University of Glasgow. He's also held many visiting appointments. His most recent publications include Mobility and Migration, Post-Colonial Archaeology's Material Connections in the Ancient Mediterranean with A. Bernard Knapp, Articulating Local Identities with Nicola Terrenato, and Rural Landscapes of the Punic World with Carlos Gomez Bellard. Professor van Dommelen serves as co-editor of the international peer-reviewed Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology and as a member of the editorial board of World Archaeology. He's a founding co-editor of Archaeological Dialogues. His extensive fieldwork includes service as joint co-director of the Riu Manu Survey Project on colonial rural settlement in coastal West Central Sardinia. Next, Johanna Hanick is Associate Professor of Classics and Robert Gale Noyes Assistant Professor of Humanities at Brown University, where she is also a member of the graduate field faculty in the Department of Theatre Arts and Performance Studies. She received her BA from the University of Michigan and an MA from the University of California, Berkeley, with an MPhil and PhD from Queen's College, Cambridge. Her research focuses on ancient theatre and performance and the cultural life of classical Athens. In her work and many publications, Professor Hanick consistently points to the dynamic, constructed, and contingent nature of Greek antiquity. Her first book, Lycurgan, Athens, and the Making of Classical Tragedy, published in the Cambridge Classical Studies series, argues that Athenians themselves invented the notion of classical tragedy just a few generations after the city's defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Her second book, The Classical Debt, Greek Antiquity in an Era of Austerity, questions the way we value Greece only in terms of an idealized ancient past, and it presents an historical account of Europe's chronic, somewhat complicated disappointment with Greek modernity. Johanna Hanick is Director of Undergraduate Studies in Classics at Brown. She's also active in Brown's program in Modern Greek Studies. She's a member of the editorial board of the noted Journal of Modern Greek Studies and a bi-monthly columnist for Eidolon, a noted online journal for non-formal and engaged scholarly writing about classics. Please welcome our interlocutors for today.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also, most of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here to you and to have been able to, not only to hear, but also to preview and think about Professor Lahiri's lecture. Because what we've heard here this afternoon was a very careful, nuanced, and insightful lecture that clearly draws on many years of experience working with India's monuments, archaeological sites, archaeological heritage, but also sort of caring about it, working amidst those remains. And so there's therefore a rich material to respond to, and I could have probably done that in more than one way, and that's precisely the reason why there's two respondents of us here. But the approach that I wish to take in these 10-15 minutes have been allotted here, I'm signaling with the title of my talk here, Decolonizing Heritage, and sort of backed up by this image, which is one of Diego de Rivera's murals in Mexico City. To begin to go with that one, this mural by Diego de Rivera is painted in the Presidential Palace in 1942, and it's part of his series of Aztec murals. And Aztec murals that he executed, he made properly to highlight and to celebrate the pre-colonial, or more generally the sort of non-colonial, the non-Spanish, or rather indigenous cultural achievements and culture in general in Mexico. And I wish to draw attention here not so much to just the colonial context of Professor Lahiri's lecture, and because we're actually talking more about that last Friday already, but rather to the post-colonial context. And sort of, in fact, her lecture started in 1947. And I want to do so in a comparative context, and to some extent necessarily so, as I'm not terribly well at home in the Indian material, but most of all to sort of provide a wider perspective. And for that I will take you mostly to the ancient and especially the modern Mediterranean, West Mediterranean in particular. The connection here with Professor Lahiri's lecture is the starting point of partition in 1947, and the obvious but necessary observation that heritage and the past more generally in that context are wrapped up in colonialism. And again, therefore my title of Decolonizing Heritage. But there's a broader context, a broader framework to all that, a context of the early phase of post-colonial authors, scholars and activists already in the 1950s and 60s. And I'm thinking here of people like the poet Aimé Césaire in Martinique, the historian Abdellah Laroui in Morocco and Algeria, and of course Frans Fanon in Martinique and later also in Algeria, who emphasized very explicitly the need not just to decolonize the countries, but also to decolonize to decolonize their history. And my point is precisely that decolonizing heritage is part and parcel of that. The background, the post-colonial background to all of that, of course, is scenes like these. And it was Edward Said who led post-colonial scholarship in this regard to demonstrate to the extent to which academic knowledge was embedded in Western colonial engagement. And so here this is seen from Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. And that's just sort of brings all these sort of elements clearly together, which has been sort of discussed in quite some detail by historians and archaeologists who have demonstrated, in fact, that it went much further than just this. This wasn't a one-off moment. It was the starting point of something that sort of has gone on, has had ramifications in many directions, and also long through time. And just one example here is from Algeria, these brigades topographiques that were set up to survey the country, but at the same time, to surveying the country, keeping an eye to what was happening there, including documenting the archaeological heritage. All these things were part of one and the same activity. Another example is that the French Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres was originally set up in the early 19th century as part of the Ministry of Colonies, as it was the military who were documenting so many of those remains. And just as a matter of the longevity of these months, this is 1958. In the early years of the intensification of the Algerian conflict, where you see a brigade of the Foreign Legion, where it was deemed necessary that at their entrance into the country they marched through this Roman arch, which is nowhere near the coast but in the center of the country. So this, from Napoleon through 1958, these are long-standing connections that have gone on for a long time, and heritage is in a dire need of being decolonized. To go back to the Indian case, Professor Lahiri precisely showed those sort of phenomena, and I think the best example there was the decolonization of the mutiny monuments. That was a sort of very nice and very sort of impressive way how that was done, a great example of it. But much of Professor Lahiri's lecture actually was dedicated to the more recent decades. And the more recent decades, the contemporary world, which in fact is the remit of these lectures here. So let's move on to that. And this is, certainly in the Mediterranean, this is the contemporary world of much heritage, where commercial development and economic pressure are a significant problem for the preservation or conservation of heritage. It's this sort of images, and this is in central Rome, that have become sort of commonplace throughout Europe, where developer-driven and archaeology has become ever more important since the 1980s, 1990s. And although this is the sort of the prevalence of practice in the Mediterranean these days for excavations, it is obviously not these excavations and heritage that get most attention. Those are the sites like Ostia and Pompeii, but they're not exemplary in that sense. And I think it's scenes like these that we should juxtapose to the situations that we heard described in Ganesha and Kakrakot in India. In more recent decades, though, the economic pressure has also taken different shapes. This is Venice, just around the corner from the San Marco. And it is these economic pressures where cruise ships of this size are a daily, sort of almost daily sight in central Venice. And it is taken for granted, it is accepted that the pressure they bring, the numbers of people, but also just the other pressures that to get vessels like this close to central Venice, that is part of it. So it is not just developer-led economic development. Its tourism is ever more a major pressure. And it is these kind of economic pressures that become a real problem because they bring with them notable ethical problems, obviously. But there's another dimension to it that we've only sort of touched on here and there, and that is the politicization of heritage. And there's various ways. Some of these, and here you see banknotes and stamps from Tunisia that go back to the sort of the post-colonial state that sort of associates itself with particular parts of the archaeological heritage, which has led further politicization in hand. But there's a further dimension to it, and you'll see that in that lower fragment there. It is online, many more different groups, interest groups from various backgrounds are associating themselves with various parts of the heritage, are promoting it, or on the other hand, sort of are denouncing it. And the result is a blurring of boundaries between nationalist, patriotist, identity groups, tourism, all sort of foregrounding, selecting, emphasizing different parts of the archaeological heritage and complicating heritage and how we should be moving around this case. And there are no sort of easy solutions, of course, through that. So the big question, of course, is indeed, what is the way forward here? Professor Lahiri dedicated an important part of her talk to that, and I would like to highlight really and emphasize, and I agree with her call, that heritage needs to matter just more. Professor Lahiri discussed a series of issues, proposals that are all important, as she rightly notes that it doesn't make sense. Indeed, it is indeed counterproductive to stick to the old colonial logic of heritage legislation and organization, precisely with that proliferation, with that blurring of boundaries between the state, different interest groups, that's no longer tenable. Sharing information is an important part of this, but I would like to add at this point that in India in particular, there's a rich post-colonial tradition, at least in the academic world, that we can draw on in this regard. And that would be not just to think of monuments and heritage in terms of national and elite pasts, but to turn to the subaltern and to take seriously the way the subaltern perspectives of monuments and of the places and landscapes indeed that matter to the subaltern groups in the country. First of all, these are the contemporary subaltern, that is, those people who already are prioritizing certain versions and aspects of the past. And sort of the little insert here is an example of that, where a group of people sort of got together and erected a little monument at one place just of their own. This is not sort of waiting for a state or a province or anyone else to sort of authorize it, organize it, just people sort of clubbing together and putting up this particular monument to make a point of their own. The second point is that of the subaltern of the past, or the subaltern in the past themselves. And this is where the wider picture here will exemplify that. What you see on your right is a Byzantine church, which is a sort of the view of the Sardinia's heritage. It's on the island of Sardinia. That would normally be emphasized, the big Roman monuments with the columns and these churches like that. And usually the picture would be, the presentation would be sort of cut in half, so you just get the presentation. In actual fact, in the field, in the landscape, that's where the landscape perspective comes in, it is the association with this big stone-built tower, which is a prehistoric Bronze Age tower, a so-called nuraghe, that, of course, as you can see from, as you can appreciate from this wider perspective, was not accidentally found itself next to the church. Rather, of course, the tower is much older than the church. The church was not built accidentally on that particular spot. And it's just part and part we have a local significant place, a juxtaposition and an association between two buildings that our conventional Western classification, our chronology, would want to keep separate, but that in the landscape, perception of the landscape really go together. So rather than having a church that signals Christianization of a landscape, we see in combination with the nuraghe, we see a local absorption, a local appropriation of Christianity on local terms. And hence, a term that can capture this kind of perspectives of these kind of situations with monuments like these, what I would like to term subaltern monuments. And given the rich tradition of the subaltern studies group in Indian academia, that would seem to be a fertile ground to sort of explore those themes further. And it could even go some way to sort of to turn to another famous debate about giving voice to the subaltern, trying to sort of take these landscapes and these kind of monuments seriously might go some way in that direction. Because it is in fact not irrelevant and certainly no coincidence that a greater attention to subaltern monuments and landscapes in Sardinia comes with the fact that Antonio Gramsci was precisely born on this and passed at least his youth on this island and returned to it sort of fairly frequently. He was in fact born just 15 minutes drive from this particular place and probably would have known these monuments. And therefore, I think it is appropriate to end here with this portrait of Antonio Gramsci and a call to foreground the subaltern dimension of landscapes, monuments, and heritage in general. Thank you.
Just find your presentation. This is it. Would this be it? No. I think I saw it. Yeah? Let me see. Here. Is this it? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much to Professor Lahiri for an unbelievable sort of stretch of days that we've had here. I've learned so much from these lectures and have become so interested in this material. I'm really grateful and honored to be a part of such an interesting and complex and urgent discussion with such distinguished experts and colleagues. So thank you for letting me be a part of it. As you might have been able to guess from Professor Gandhi's very generous introduction, I'm a complete interloper in this conversation, but a very interested one. I'm just a classicist, and I think I'm by far the least cosmopolitan of the group. So, but I do want to raise some questions, really, more than offer sort of a pointed commentary. It's often annoying when people sort of use these occasions to more completely divert into, well, what does this have to do with what I'm thinking about at the moment? But I'm hoping to use what I'm thinking about at the moment to open up a broader conversation. This semester, I've been teaching a course called Old News, Antiquity and Current Events through the Koga Now Institute for the Humanities. We even had some students here, which is wonderful. And these lectures, these wonderful lectures, have brought up sort of so many of the questions that we've been asking in the course, and I'm going to really focus on two of them. I first want to say that I found extremely compelling in today's lecture this the sort of plea at the end for stronger collaboration between sort of from the ground up in the state, between local interlocutors and the state. I found very compelling the call to see antiquity as a shared inheritance. This image of partitioning that sort of carried through the lecture in some more metaphorical ways than others, I found extremely interesting. I'm sure I'm not the only one to think of, with the story about Mortimer Wheeler dividing the jewelry, to think of the sort of parable of King Solomon and the baby. And I think, too, that I found particularly interesting the material about the removal of colonial symbols and this very interesting phrase, colonial messaging, from the statues, especially as right now in the United States we're in the midst of so many of these kinds of conversations about how buildings are named on campuses. And so I found this extremely rich. What I want to bring it to first is this question of the past as a resource, and this sort of very difficult yet compelling and again urgent question of the sort of economies of the past and the different ways that we might imagine those. Professor Hamilakis has done so much to teach us about the use of antiquities as symbolic commodities, and I want to really ventriloquize rather than push the agenda of Cornelius Holtorf, who in a very interesting paper posed this question of whether the past it really is indeed a non-renewable resource. This paper he delivered the paper in 1998 at a conference. It was published in 2001. And the very question of whether the past is a non-renewable resource brings up an argument that I'm sure many people in this room know extremely well by Arjun Upadurai, this question of the past is a scarce resource. In the case of Upadurai, the past being a scarce resource has to do more with the parameters that any culture sets for the discussion or the debate of the past. But Holtorf in his piece takes this question of the past as a non-renewable resource a little bit more literally, imposing a series of assumptions that he thinks that the sort of Western heritage discourse makes, and then attempting to undermine those. So I just want to bring these up in this context as some fodder for further discussion. Again, just raising them rather than pushing them. And I do want to emphasize that Holtorf himself, in the course of his paper, does emphasize the importance of preservation as part of the brief of the archaeologist. So in terms of the assumptions that he seeks to challenge, there are four. And so the first is that archaeological sites and objects are authentic, so of true antiquity, and have a distinctive aura, so of course referring back to Benjamin, which fakes and copies do not have. The second assumption is that archaeological sites and objects are irreplaceable and non-renewable because we cannot go back into the past and remake them. So the third is that in the modern Western world, which he's writing about, archaeological sites and objects are in danger of being destroyed by various forces, including some of the ones that we heard about in the course of tonight's lecture. And finally, that professional archaeologists save archaeological sites and objects from further destruction on behalf of future generations who are expected to be grateful that they too can appreciate these sites and objects and thus the past. So I'm sure that most people in this room, or everybody in this room, can guess the kinds of objections that he makes to these sorts of assumptions. I mean, his article itself, it's provocative, it's controversial, and I think the challenges that he poses are both of those in each case. So in the first case, he really emphasizes that he says in virtually all circumstances, age, authenticity, and aura are not essences of sites or objects, but human constructs. He goes on responding to the second one, right, with an idea again about how different societies in different eras consider or regard the past in different ways, and thus the way that we might want to remake a past will not be an enduring sort of view of the past. Addressing this issue of what he says about the modern Western world, he suggests that no society, this is a quote, has surrounded itself with as many archaeological sites and objects as the modern society in the Western world. So again, he's speaking about a sort of specific kind of thinking, and points to archives. So if you imagine, for example, the British Museum's storehouse underneath the museum, which is just full of objects that nobody really knows what to do with and are not, in fact, on display for everyone. And finally, this last, that professional archaeologists can save archaeological sites and objects from further destruction. Again, this issue that authentic ancient sites, he argues, are not the origin, but rather the product of contingent cultural appreciations of the past. So I just wanted to raise these again as points for discussion for what exactly, as we think about the question of what exactly we're doing when we try to preserve heritage, which again, Holtorf himself also agrees is an important thing to do. So just introducing some further complications. And I suppose that I've been thinking about these kinds of issues in the context of thinking, as a person who's mostly focused on literature and was trained as a literature person more than anything else. I'm very interested right now in how people who work on non-material heritage can be a part of the critical heritage debate. And this is something that we really struggled with and talked about quite a bit in the class on old news, where we talked about everything from Israeli settlements in Palestine to the proliferation right now of comparisons to the United States and Britain with imperial Republican Rome about to fall. So how do we put what we might file under sort of more intellectual, intangible heritage alongside issues of material heritage and talk about them with a shared critical discourse? This is something that interests me right now. And in the case of India, I just thought that I would raise one example that we spoke about in the class this semester. We had Professor David Bhutta, who's our lecturer in Sanskrit, come and talk to us about this phenomenon, which, as he pointed out, is really sort of nothing new, that the Sanskrit epics are very popular, but in this case now enjoying a certain kind of popularity thanks to the success of this sort of fan fiction on the ancient epics that's being published in English and is enormously successful. And I thought it was interesting the way that we heard an instance in the lecture tonight of the mention of a place in the Mahabharata as a kind of authorizing heritage, sort of a moment of authorization for a site's importance as a heritage site. So I guess I wonder, again, how we can take the sort of different strands of interest in the past right now, sort of interest in textual aspects of the past, interest in the legacy of ideas from the past, and talk about them under similar rubrics as those with which we debate and examine concepts of critical or of material heritage. So, thank you.
Very many thanks to all three of you for so much to think about. Professor Lahiri, would you like to begin with some immediate responses to Johanna and Peter, or should we perhaps just a couple of quick responses and then we'll open up?
So very quickly, thank you, Peter and Johanna. Very interesting that you should have raised Cornelius, Holtorf's work, and I'm sure there are people here who would respond. My only response is to something that Peter said about subaltern monuments, and given the tradition of subaltern research, the subaltern school in India, I want to emphasize that as far as the historians of modern India goes, and that includes the subalterns, and most historians of medieval India as well, archaeology is actually very far. Monuments, subaltern monuments is one thing, but looking at sites as as rich sources of information for all kinds of things, this is something which is not done in India in any serious way. Monuments are important in terms of the medieval architectural heritage, but nothing else. And similarly, monuments of modern India only matter in terms of, let's say, looking at the colonial capitals and so on and so forth. So again, the question of sensitizing people to the issues of heritage should include the scholarly community as well. And the subalterns have done very important things, but this has remained very far from the way they look at India.
First Vazira, then Ashu, then Prerna.
Thank you. I didn't want to be the first one to ask the question today, but I guess I will go ahead. I loved the place where your talk started, which was the division of archaeological material culture between India and Pakistan, which was a division which was very belligerent. But here you saw, especially in the jewelry, the division of the pieces in such a way that two new things were created from that division, an otherwise belligerent division, but one here which was transformed into a new kind of creative act. And when I think about a lot of the Buddhist sites that I've been looking at in what is Pakistan now, most of them are also attached to local forms of Sufi shrines and worship. The two, the ways in which sort of subaltern life takes over and these remains of the past become part of everyday practices in life and over time is one way in which one might think about reconceiving of archaeological landscapes as also sort of within a sort of subaltern lens. However, if we think about the two silences in your talk, which was both Gaya and Ayodhya, right? Both Gaya and Ayodhya, both of them sort of resonating with the question of the colonial legacy of archaeology in India, and particularly sort of thinking about what did archaeology coming in a colonial context do for our understanding of the past and its material culture. Both Gaya contested between Buddhists and it was this, and I guess it's talked about a lot in the Indian context. So perhaps the reason for the absence of this site in your conversation, but that's one of the contest between Buddhists and Hindus. To put it simply, and then immediately post 47, the government intervenes and makes it a dual worship site, something that the colonial state refused to adjudicate on, and it became a sort of embattled and difficult site. But then the Nehruvian state, adjudicates and makes it a dual worship site. Ayodhya, with again multiple religious claimants to the site, and a deeply contested site, since where specifically archaeology's role in the contestations over the site was of course really important, especially the mobilization of its scientific evidence against other claimants on the site. And so when I think about colonial archaeology's legacy, one of the things that it's done is actually sort of divide up the landscape between Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, right? And one of the openings or possibilities has been to restore at least the possibility of multi-religious landscape within this material landscape. Yet, of course, the contestations and the pressures on any of these sites, unlike the environment, pollution, development projects, etc., is that there are deeply divided notions of the past, which then play themselves out on and around and with these sites. So anyway, to bring back sort of the fundamental cleavage produced by colonial archaeology, which is one of conceiving of the historical past in sort of separate Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist past, and then now the task of post-colonial archaeology in a way to have to come in and do something else.
Okay. Thank you, Wazira, for your comments, specifically on Bodh Gaya and Ayodhya. I didn't speak about Bodh Gaya because I've actually written, and this was published extensively on, the whole Bodh Gaya dispute. And I just felt that if I started speaking on Bodh Gaya, that would be, half the paper. So it was a question of talking about things which were less known. And since I had access to the files of the Archaeological Survey, files which went into the first decade of this century, a kind of access which I don't think the ASI, when they gave me permission, realized that, I'd come up with all this. So I thought I'd talk about that. But I agree with you on Bodh Gaya. But let me say here that Bodh Gaya continues to change. So when I wrote the paper on Bodh Gaya and the photographs there which show Hindu images under one of the two trees in the Bodh Gaya complex, I went there 4 years ago and those images are no longer there. So, and, thank God one just documents things. So that, under the government of Nitish Kumar, there have been changes of a kind which I don't feel comfortable with at all. Because as a matter of fact, Bodh Gaya has been a part of the, Hindu sort of movement, the pilgrim circle, which includes Vishnupad and so on and so forth. On the question of Ayodhya, yes, again, it's a long dispute. It definitely goes back to the 19th century. And here I just want to say that in the 19th century, the late 19th century, the issues were different. Actually, the issue was that the Mahant there wanted to construct a temple on the Ram Chabutra. There was no, there was nothing in terms of wanting to construct or take over the place where the Babri Masjid stood. And that was not allowed by British authorities. I would say, as a matter of fact, the turning point, and Muslims continue to offer namaz at the Babri Masjid till 1949. It was in December 1949 that, and there are intelligence reports to show that the government knew that this was about to happen. So I'm not even talking of what happened, in the 1990s. This is 1949, they were aware of it, and yet, an image of Ram Lalla was introduced, into the Babri Masjid, and things led from, one thing to another. I think if Gandhi was alive, things might have been different, because in the case of Delhi, Gandhi played a very important role in going to the different Sufi shrines which were attacked and, making people feel utterly ashamed of themselves. In the case of Ayodhya, you have Nehru writing to Chief Minister, of Uttar Pradesh, that is Pant. And Pant keeps telling him, no, you don't need to come, and so on and so forth. And Nehru keeps saying, no, I have to come. This is just awful what has happened. And eventually he doesn't go. I think things may have been different if he had gone immediately and measures were taken to ensure that the image was removed. Because remember, for instance, the Chauburji Mosque, which is on the ridge in the Delhi University area, an image of Hanuman was introduced into that mosque. And the police came and removed that image in September 1947. And I, of course, agree with you that the whole idea of dividing monuments in terms of Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim. And of course, the British, for them, we are just, it's not Christian. It's just British. They're sort of above a division of monuments with reference to themselves in relation to religion. I think it's been awful because somewhere it has completely obliterated the changing history of a monument, the fact that there are places of worship where there are all kinds of communities who have a stake, and so on and so forth. Finally, on the question of archaeology and Ayodhya, I think it's, what can one say that, when you have a court which tries to ask archaeologists to solve a property dispute among Hindus and Muslims, but apart from just asking for that, if you read the judgment, that is what is very, very troublesome. I'm not going to speak at length about it because it is sub judice, but the Allahabad, High Court judgment. The archaeological survey of India's findings, according to them, cannot be contested because, in the words of Justice Agarwal, they are the experts of the experts, right? But all the other witnesses and all the other information that is put by, the people who are on the side of the Muslim board and so on and so forth, every little bit of that is pilloried by the judges. So I'm not sure if this is going to set a precedent for the future and how eventually the Ayodhya dispute will be resolved. But it's unprecedented in terms of Indian archaeology.
Less interested in the specificity of this rather than the possibility of restoring multi-religious affect.
The point is that as far as restoring multi-religious worship, that goes on regard. We shouldn't imagine, whether it is in British times or in contemporary India, that the government has such complete hegemonic success that it can actually ensure that there is only one kind. There's all kinds of worship which goes on in many different places, and that's really most reassuring.
Ashu?
Yeah, thank you, Nayanjot, for two very instructive lectures. I have a very specific question about today's, and then a large philosophical question for all three of you. The specific question is your reference to, concerns your reference to attacks on Sufi shrines and perhaps you said, if I heard you right, about Shah Alam's grave attack, etc., around the communal frenzy of partition. Do we have any evidence about how these frenzied mobs looked at the monuments of Lodi Gardens, Sheesh Gumbad and Bada Gumbad? Did they think of those sites as worthy of their hatred and destruction, worthy of destruction? So just a factual question, I don't know the answer. I've always been fascinated by those two Gumbads and have spent countless hours there. So hence the question. The larger philosophical question is can be formulated in one sentence, and then I'll explain further. The argument about preserving archaeological sites or restoring them, or can that project in modern times and the modern state anywhere be separated from utilitarian impulses? Now, from utilitarian impulses. So that they provide great aesthetic pleasure is beyond doubt. They have provided me great aesthetic pleasure. That they are sites of knowledge about our past. These would be all non-instrumental forms of reasoning. But the modern instrumental forms of reasoning, if we follow Weber, would be are they generating revenue? Are they source of another form of instrumental motivation for a modern state would be not only tourism and revenue, which would be very material, but are they source of pride and in strengthening the nation, etc.? That could be an instrumental form of reasoning. But if the key here is this: if we make an argument about commitment of public resources, then we need a rationale for why the resources should be spent that way. To which sites should the resources be more allocated, to which sites less? And has the modern state anywhere, I'm not talking only about India, has the modern state anywhere been able to make judgments about how to allocate resources for preservation of sites in non-instrumental ways, purely in terms of aesthetic pleasure and as sources of information about our past?
Very quickly on the Lodi monuments, I didn't come across any files which showed attacks on Virodi monuments.
Thank God.
Okay. And, on the larger question, I think our commentators should say something.
Well, I think you should perhaps begin to say, to answer that these states or states are just making those decisions all the time, every day. Or representatives, people working on behalf of the state, whether they get it right that's really the question. And in some occasions they probably do, but there's going to be just as many where they don't. And I think there's just no coherence between these things, and it's also inevitable. Whether you were asking utilitarian, but how far do you go defining what is utilitarian? Does it have to make money? You mentioned sort of the strength of the nation. You could think about in sort of light of the question that Fazira brought up. You could think about the coherence and the unity of communities in a country, whether that is the same as the strength of the nation, you could argue about, and so these would be various actions that go different ways. I think what you see happening is heritage, what I think is the main point really, if I put it that way, is to avoid mindless destruction and just sort of continuous power construction going on. Take the example of the slide I showed of Venice. That's a slide that makes a big impression, yes. But at the same time, it's also very rhetorical, and I'll say that straight away, because at the same time, you don't want to go back to a time where it's only people on the Grand Tour who can visit the San Marco. So, although you might perhaps begin to argue those who can afford a cruise like that perhaps are sort of some equivalent there, but I think that is, so the answer to your question should perhaps not be it is this state or that service that has got it right, or there's your manual. There are, well, in Europe, there's the European Association of Archaeology. They've been trying to come up with sort of manuals of good practice and that sort of thing, but that usually doesn't go very far. It is avoiding or thinking about what you do, and then you as being authorities, whether it's at the national level from the Prime Minister, as you say, who can make a real difference, but also to local communities and local municipalities. And I think, so there's no straightforward answer to your question, but I don't think you, well, it would have been great to hope that there was one, but I think it is sort of at that level. I hope that's...
But another way, if I may
yeah.
Get another 30 seconds. What do we know about the impulses that the pre-modern states had about these sites? Were they more given to grandeur and aesthetic pleasure and knowledge than modern states are, or there also you had this kind of, you said, chaotic decision making and picking one over the other on the basis of what the emperor thinks is right, or yeah?
I suppose it is not all chaotic at the moment. It depends on sort of how unified or authoritarian a state is, that they can get their things organized. So, but it is, no, you've had always through the past, people have looked at the past, and I think that the inherent problem with heritage is, as with the past and history in general, there's no single past. It even depends on times, but even in any given time, there's multiple perspectives, and so avoiding to write roughshod over that multiplicity of perception and experience, that if people could agree to sort of take that seriously, that would be a great start.
Can I just add to it? In the case of the Indian state, it's not just the state. The state is very important, but there are many instances where monuments get protected because of local communities petitioning. So the Gauri Sagar Kund, in the Tezpur area, that happened because of the local community. A lot of pressure was generated, and eventually that came. So, the fact that you get your votes from a lot of these communities, and if they are very vociferous about some of this, it can happen.
But that is where your point about colonial laws is important. It resonated with me as well, because in Mediterranean countries like Italy, where legislation dates back 1-2 centuries and is typically geared to the preservation of statues, mosaics, and that sort of stuff, local communities who care very much for local archaeology, which is not a statue or a mosaic, but they can get in trouble if they look after things because they're not supposed to, they're not authorized, they don't have the stamp of approval. And so updating some of that legislation. But then you immediately enter into these practicalities and nitty-gritty where there is no easy right or wrong. And that's just, things get messy, but I guess that's because life there is messy. So.
I suppose that all that I would add to it is I think it's very interesting, the politics of these questions of what counts as heritage anyway, which that sort of decision is always, I mean, just around here, there also seems to be, there are some cases where there seems to be too much of it around, which can, sort of like Civil War cannons in Georgia, or places where George Washington supposedly spent the night in the Northeast Corridor. Or there are movements even to protect New England's stone walls, but everybody's got them in their yard, right? So where some people might look and think that it's completely barbaric the way that we let them fall apart, right? Other people, these sort of practical matters of who gets to decide that this is what gets protected, I find very interesting.
So what I'm going to do is do a rapid fire round. I've forgotten the popular source for that anyway, and use the privilege of the chair to add my voice to the rapid fire round, which is what's emerged over the last two of lectures and discussions, which is very interesting from a post-colonial perspective, is and I'm only polemicizing for the sake of argument, a discrepancy between a sort of critique of the European heritage industry, sort of thing that Johanna works on as well, of a sort of culture industry, on the one hand, and on the other, an argument in defense of the sort of non-Western, let me even call it more boldly, third world heritage industry, and I'd just be interested to see what more can be said about that tension. So that's my question, and then I have, in this order, Prerna, Yanis, the gentleman over there, Nipa. Anyone else want to throw in their money's worth? Yes? Anyone else? No? Last call? Yay! Excellent. Okay, let's go.
Great. So actually my question goes quite nicely with both Vazira, Ashu was in the discussion, which is to me, so that Ashu, your point about what exactly is the rationale for preserving this and the discussion since, to me, if I was a state, I would not preserve monuments in a haphazard fashion. And I would put all my money, a significant portion of money, into them. And this is why I think nations think of monuments as very concrete manifestations of what constitutes a nation. And that's a kind of central issue if you look at the US, just in the last week, for the fact that monuments are cast in stone, they've been remarkably fluid. And the fact that monuments are on the move are, I think, a reflection of far more seismic changes. So just two instances. The city of New Orleans removed in complete secrecy. The people removing this monument are wearing ski masks, and there are snipers on roofs to make sure that they are not attacked. They removed the first of 5 Confederate monuments. And Donald Trump signs an order that for the first time in the history of the US actually calls into question the status of national monuments. So the first time in the history of the US, an existing national monument could lose its status. And this, to me, on the one hand, a city saying these Confederate soldiers do not represent what we stand for. And on the other hand, Trump saying, I can decide what we decide to memorialize and remember are exactly the kind of sites on which contests over monuments happen, which is why I think, your talks are so appreciated and have been so instructive, because to me, these get to the heart of what constitutes a nation. And so my question to you, Professor Lahiri, would be that, you began this talk by really talking about, on the one hand, this debate between development and monuments. But is there a way in which, especially in this context, we can think, it's no coincidence that Nehru had said that dams are the temples of modern India. So you can think of the construction of the Indian nation after independence as being this development-defined vision of a nation. Development becomes the national ideology. And to some extent, your call for the kind of local efforts to recover and preserve monuments is the Gandhian alternative view of nationalism. And so, is there a way in which, the kind of unspoken word in this room that I think is so central to why we put up monuments in the first place is, what do we think we constitute as a nation?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you all for these wonderful presentations, and I think we can all now see also the connection between the two events, because I think they two go together really, really well, and they raise a number of interesting issues. I'll try to be very brief and pick up only a couple of points. I, of course, endorse wholeheartedly the call for a kind of a heritage from below, an attempt to actually empower local communities to protect their own what they consider their own heritage. But if we start with the question, I think we start the discussion, how can we sensitize the locals? I think we are actually asking the wrong question. Because that question can be construed as a kind of almost patronizing kind of attempt to say, we will come here to show you why these things are important. As we have learned from a number of local studies, a number of ethnographic studies, a number of studies on the ethnography of heritage, there is a lot of knowledge, sensitivity, affective connection, as we showed, as you showed, all of you, the three of you, with very specific kind of monuments. So there is sensitivity out there. It's maybe a different kind of sensitivity for different kinds of monuments, for different kinds of material traces or localities. So it's not a matter of us making locals sensitive to heritage, it's a matter of understanding other kinds of knowledge beyond the scholarly, beyond the academic, other kinds of affective connections beyond our own connection to monuments as academics and scholars. And in relation to the very interesting and important point that Azira brought, the role of archaeologists in all this. And I think that's something we rarely actually question, because we did not excavate heritage, we excavate material traces of different times. We produce heritage, we produce monuments. We produce monuments out of specific practices of materiality, of knowledge, of power. So that process of production, of declaring something as monument, as heritage, is something we do not question enough. And if I missed something in our presentation, in your presentation today, is that reflexivity issue of how are we responsible for the heritage phenomenon we are seeing today, and how can we go beyond it? And I think to come back to the final point that I think Johanna mentioned and brought up in her presentation, how do we define heritage, but also how do we expand the domain of heritage to include contemporary material realities. For many people, it's their immediate contemporary material fabric and domain that they valorize and value. To what extent are we prepared to say, yes, if this is important for people's lives, it should be considered worth valorizing, preserving, understanding further. So it's in a sense a plea for an archaeology of the present, and contemporary archaeology, or an archaeology which does not actually define itself on the basis of rigid and strict chronological provisions.
Wow, these are great questions. My question has to do with a comment that was made by one of the panelists that we're making the past all the time. And so we continue to create past every moment. And that past is often in conflict with the more distant past. I mean, if you take this country, for example, a long time before we got here, there was a Native American culture here, which has now pretty much been moved beyond, and we're not that culture anymore. And so it sort of goes to this gentleman's question here, which is how do we evaluate what we want to continue to save and preserve when there's new things being saved and preserved, being made all the time, and those things, some of those things that were made and preserved in the past are no longer relevant, or no longer in the right place, or no longer can be preserved because our cities get bigger. You know, it's the picture of the excavation in Venice, or I guess it was Rome, where you had some old archaeological site there, and it's not going to be there for long because there's going to be something else there. So how do we decide?
Thank you very much for 2 fascinating lectures and all the comments that are going with it. It's great because it seems like, and my question also kind of relates to this tension between what kind of questions should we be asking, and then how do we actually, because maybe we have a few political scientists here and policy people, how do we put this into action? I was actually very curious from this Third World Heritage angle and the idea that you put forth, Peter, about decolonizing heritage, about the role of the Archaeological Survey of India. I'm referencing Ashish Chadda's work on his kind of deep ethnography of Dholavira, where he talks about the modern ASI as a continued story of post-colonial oppression in context to local and subaltern spaces, in terms of excavation practices, thinking about the Wheelerian grid system that's still put into practice. And I'm very curious then, with this idea you have of subaltern monuments, we've seen kind of in other policy projects in India, for example, JFM, Joint Forestry Management, where there has been success in involving village panchayats, as you were talking about. But who would be kind of governing this? If this is still within the framework of the ASI, do we start arguing for a kind of decolonization of how we even think about who is governing these kind of practices? Because it seems like, of course, with also the idea of resource allocation, that a lot of the allocated resources would still go towards tourist sites versus those that are part of this subaltern practice.
Thank you.
I just like to place another focus on the everyday person, independent of the archaeologist or the powers that be. Should we consider variations in national sentiment as an influence on how people revere the past or material culture?
And there was a gentleman here, I think he's fled. I thought it was you.
Yes, my question has almost been answered. Just I would like to know if there is some initiative to try to get this down-top approach, kind of community archaeology, surveys to people, anthropological work with them to know what they think about their heritage and so on.
Thank you. May I invite you for some quick responses, and then there's a wonderful reception where we can continue this. But quick responses to both these.
So, I think we can talk about this at the reception, but just some very quick responses. Yanis, on the question of the patronizing sort of trope when you talk about sensitizing locals, I agree, but there are 2 points here. First of all, in many parts of North India, you've had large displacements of population. So you have people coming from different parts of what is now Pakistan and settling down. And I think the kind of engagement that a community that has been there for a long time, there's a difference. So, I mean, I don't think sensitizing is always necessarily something which is patronizing. It's necessary. But the second more important issue is that the way history is taught at the schools in India is completely textual. So my son studied, Ashu mentioned the Lodhi Gardens. So for a few years, he studied in Air Force Bal Bharati School, which was across the road from the Lodhi Garden monuments. It didn't cost even a rupee to take students to the gardens and look at the monuments and talk about the histories of those monuments, but that was never done. So, there is an issue there that I think the state has failed in terms of the kind of history, of the knowledge of history that is imparted. It cannot just be on the basis of books and so on and so forth. On the question of the Rome example, I'm sure Peter would have something to say about it, but I think the difference between India and a lot of Europe today and America is that here you have contract archaeology, so
when you're clearing areas for development work, if something turns up, at least it's documented. In the Indian case, that is actually not built into the contracts. So even the first step hasn't been taken, that you may well decide to remove it, but at least you should document it before doing that. That, hasn't happened. And why it is, it's urgently necessary is because many cities are very old cities which, the modern cities are on ancient ones, as in the case of Rome. So one of the most important cities of ancient India was Pataliputra, and modern Patna is on the ruins of ancient Pataliputra, and there is nothing which requires anybody to report when they are digging for development reasons and stuff turns up, to get it actually documented in any way. I think, you should go ahead.
Well, I think that I would find it interesting to comment on, say, the first two questions. The one about how the state focus on monuments, and then about local sensitivities. That they're in a way, they exemplify the sort of the contrasts in society, how a society thinks about the past. Yes, a state, well, at least historically, when we see states or we look around, states try to emphasize these things in their character, but there's always going to be groups and communities who see things differently and therefore would like to see things otherwise. And the stronger a state emphasize a certain aspect, the stronger other groups and communities are going to push back and either resist that or propose alternative paths and so on. And so I think it depends what kind of state you want as well, I suppose. There's a heritage, and I think that is a great example of how heritage or archaeology more general is inherently politicized. You just, precisely because we act in the present, and you just cannot, just the decision to remove this, to have a look below, and it's in part of archaeological practice as well. In the large parts of the Mediterranean, it's impossible to excavate below a Greek or a Roman temple because that would destroy it, and so you don't. And it's that, but that's not a scientific decision; it's a political decision. And so that, I think, what the discussion here sort of nicely brings out, and that's what's important to realize. Once you've taken that on board, then you can start thinking about all the other aspects, but most of all, it should be a political decision. And that's why what you said earlier about how that judge or court is presenting archaeological decisions as experts of experts, that's, I would think, not really helping the discipline, because it helps to isolate and to alienate archaeologists as a profession. And so, but it also shows you that you are inherently part of those political processes.
One word. That's okay. Well, you would agree that all of you, that Professor Nayanjot Lahiri's visit has been the most wonderful prompt for interdisciplinary and international conversation at the Center for Contemporary South Asia. On behalf of the Center, I'd like to thank Professor Lahiri for her extraordinary lectures, and in alphabetical order, Tamara Chin, Peter van Dommelen, Yanis Hamilakis, and Johanna Hanick for their wonderful conversation and response. Please join me in these thanks.